The peoples of North America. The objectives are: 1. Identify and describe the first inhabitants of the Americas, the hunters and gatherers, and describe later inhabitants who practiced farming. And 2, discuss the great variety of climate and geographic features that contributed to the many different cultures that emerged in the Americas. Now, first, speaking about a geographical sense of North America and the Americas in general. The Americas span somewhere around 9,000 miles from the Arctic Ocean to Cape Horn in South America. The various landscapes are quite diverse. You have ice-covered lands to the north and very far south. You have dense forests, river valleys, coastlines, tropical forests, deserts. You have major geographical areas that provide separation and distinction. You have major mountain ranges in particular, the Rocky Mountains and the Andes. You also have major river systems, the Mississippi and the Amazon, which is interesting that these two river systems will be somewhat distinct from the river systems we've seen in the interconnected globe and global communities in the past, like the Nile, like the Mesopotamian, like the Indus River Valley. So this is going to be distinctly different and develop much later than we see in other places. Now, the first Americans, in the sense of those who have stepped onto what we know as the American soil, is between 100,000 and 8,000 years ago, somewhere in that span, which is quite broad. We see the first humans migrate into that territory. Now, really, the last ice age produced a low sea level, right? With all of the cold weather, you have a lot of ice, which drops the overall sea level quite down. And it created a land bridge in the area of the Bering Strait, really the region that separated Asia from North America. And so it's believed that these early humans pursuing game, pursuing bison and caribou, that they followed these animals as they migrated to the North American territory. What we know as modern-day Canada, Alaska, North America, all the way going down into South America. And really, like we've seen in many other places, the first Americans were hunters and they were gatherers of food, following the game and gathering the various goods to survive. And so, like most ancestors throughout the region, they are driven by these supplies of food. And here we can see on this map that it allowed this ice age, this ice collection in the north, allowed for the transportation from Siberia through that Alaskan territory down into North America. But of course, the way that these people survived, and of course, remember that these people are migrating not in a particular speedy way, but a few miles every generation, really allowed for the development of cultures that were really based on hunting and gathering in cold climates. So many people did stay in the far north. Even after other tribes moved further south, you still do end up having peoples in North America that stick true to some of the deeper traditions of that northern territory. Particularly in the Arctic and Northwest, we see a particular tribe, well known, the Inuit, and from somewhere around this Common Era times, we see a group of people called the Inuit move into North America from Asia. They learned unique ways to survive in a cold environment, largely still based on hunting and gathering. Then they develop an entire tradition still based around that, harpoons and spears, particularly made of horns and tusks, that really embody some of the artistic motifs of the culture. Homes were made of stone and turf, or the ever iconic, though not quite accurate, igloo, which the igloo is a temporary shelter when you're out hunting and you can't make it all the way back to camp. They didn't live in igloos. Now, the Inuit are more commonly referred to as Eskimos, which is not quite accurate. In fact, it's much more proper to refer to them as the Inuit, which is their tribal name. Now, we see other tribal groups develop in North America. Particularly, we have another region, the Eastern Woodlands people, and really, we often refer to these people as the Mound Builders. Why do we call them the Mound Builders? Because there's not really much they've left behind except some archaeological evidence. They have no written language, nor did the Inuit until modern contact. And we end up seeing that these people were infamous builders of these giant mounds whose purpose really is unclear. But these people seem to have developed their culture somewhere around 1000 BCE in this territory. And we see them dip down into the Gulf of Mexico, along the Mississippi mostly. Now, the Hopewell people in the Ohio River Valley were often referred to as these mound builders, as far as we can tell. And they built these elaborate earth mounds. Now, some argue that they were tombs for wealthy people. Others have argued that they hold some kind of spiritual significance, or maybe perhaps both. It's very unclear. But other groups emerged as well in the wake of these mound builders. The Chaco Canyon near the modern city of East St. Louis is really a massive burial mound civilization, maybe disconnected from the Hopewell to some extent. And these burial mounds are quite a popular tradition in the territory. And really, it's up until the 13th century that we see these people collapse and their civilization collapse. But again, there's not a whole lot of archaeological evidence, certainly not in the way that we see complex civilizations develop throughout the world in other territories. This is by no means the complex cities that we end up seeing in other areas. We don't see that in the north. We do among a few people groups, but nothing like what we see in other regions. Now, there were other people who stayed in the north as well. The Eastern Woodlands people, the Iroquois, are perhaps most famous, particularly as they make contact with the Western world. But the Iroquois lived in villages that consisted really of long houses that were surrounded by a wooden fence for protection. And these hunter-gatherer groups hunted bear, deer, caribou, small animals, and were very much a hunter-gatherer society to a great extent. Now, you did end up having some archaeological evidence revealing that they did have a deep agricultural structure, but they still clung to many of the roots of the hunter-gatherer style of life. Now, women owned the dwellings. They owned most of the property. They gathered wild plants, they planted seeds, harvested crops, particularly what seems to be the most important traditionally were known as the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, which are staples within the Iroquois diet, particularly in the Eastern Woodlands territories. Now, wars, of course, were common among these tribal groups. They were by no means unified prior to the legendary emergence of a peacemaker. Daganawida appeared and really preached for peace. And through his eloquence and charge for peace, a great peace, quote-unquote, emerged, an alliance really of the five groups of the Iroquois that end up being called the Iroquois League, which is in some sense a predecessor to a sort of democratic ideal that will be influential later on in the development of the American political system. Now, you end up seeing through this a council of representatives known as the Grand Council, which met to settle differences among the League. Now, women, of course, women of each clan are running things, and they select the male members of the Grand Council. which is in some sense an experiment in democracy, or at least representative government, like a republic, which will reinforce the Greco-Roman ideals of democracy that will be carried with the Westerners to the New World. Now, we also see peoples of the Great Plains, or the Plains Indians, as they're referred to. Now we would need to remember that Indian is not really a proper name that we should necessarily refer to these indigenous peoples. It was by historical accident that they are referred to as Indians. Why? Because when Christopher Columbus landed in the New World, he thought that he was off the coast of India. And so when he meets the indigenous peoples there, he refers to them as Indians. And so, not to be confused with India Indians, really these plain Indians, or by their different tribal names, really are ones who cultivated beans, corn, squash, the Three Sisters, and we also see every summer the men left their villages to hunt buffalo, which is in fact the iconic image of hunter-gatherer in and among these Great Plains tribal groups. Now, often the method by which they would gather food would be through stampedes. Stampede over a cliff would be the goal for to kill a lot of buffalo. And they would eat the meat. They used the skin for clothing and the tools. They would make tools from the bones. They would make teepees from the skin. That is their typical shelter, which is a mobile means of shelter in the plains, which is provided enough shelter for really what you see in that territory. It's thin. It's not necessarily the most warm or necessarily even the most fixed in one place, but these people migrated quite deal. So it's really only the Plains Indians that implement the famous iconic teepee. But nevertheless, you see a lot of these tribal groups that far in the north. Now, in the southwest, more towards the union and intersection between Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado as we know it, you see a much drier climate. A much drier climate in that southwest territory. But nevertheless, what's interesting is that these people, particularly the Anasazi, developed a very complex civilization that really relied on trade. And, of course, there were enough rain and enough food to support these people, but over time you end up seeing a global shift in the environment, which made it more dry and therefore, not in the long run, being able to support a large population. Now, the Anasazi peoples really established this extensive farming society from 500 to 1200 CE, which is a long civilization, 700 years. They were skilled at making baskets and pottery. That's what they were most famous for. And particularly what's most iconic and remembered of them is the stone and adobe, that is sun-dried brick, cities. They built pueblos, that is homes made of this stone and adobe. In fact, if you go to the Grand Canyon or any region around there, it's hard not to see a lot of the impressive Anasazi ruins. Some of the most famous and iconic examples are entire civilizations built into the walls of great canyons. The Chaco Canyon, that is the Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico, was really the center of the civilization and really is emblematic of the civilization's architecture. But it seems that for a period of 50 years, there was a drastic drought. A devastating drought that really destroyed the fundamental ability for the civilization to survive collectively. And so we end up seeing these communities really split apart. There were, of course, large communities that emerged as a result at Mesa Verde, buildings into the recesses of the cliff walls. But of course, again, drought led to its abandonment. And so you end up seeing the fracturing and splitting off of these cities and civilizations because they really were unsustainable in the long trajectory. as a result of environmental shifts, which it seems that many of the American civilizations fell victim to environmental catastrophes long before there was any human carbon footprint. And so the interrelationship with the environment and the human condition is inextricable. Now, the objectives were, 1, identify and describe the first inhabitants of the Americas, the hunters and gatherers, and describe later inhabitants who practiced farming in those territories. 2, discuss the great variety of climate and geographical features that contributed to the many different cultures that emerged in the Americas.